In the spring of 1847, a physician named Dr. Augustus Levine recorded something impossible in his private ledger, a ledger that would remain sealed within the New Orleans Municipal Archives for 132 years. Across 7 plantations in St. Charles Parish, over 18 months, he had delivered 47 infants to enslaved women. Each child was born with pale skin, light eyes, and features indistinguishable from white children. And each one vanished within days of birth. When Levine attempted to report his findings to parish authorities, he was informed his services were no longer required. 3 weeks later, his body was discovered in the Mississippi River, his ledger missing. But the births did not stop. They continued for another decade, spreading across Louisiana like a carefully orchestrated plague. And the children, hundreds of them, simply disappeared into a network so sophisticated that even today, historians cannot fully trace where they all went. Before we continue with the story of Dr. Augustus Levine and the children who were never meant to exist, I need you to do something. If dark historical mysteries that challenge everything we thought we knew about the past fascinate you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. I'm curious, where are you listening from right now? Drop your state or city in the comments below. Now, let's uncover what really happened in those plantation houses along the river and why an entire system worked so hard to keep it hidden. The truth about those births would eventually surface, but not in the way anyone expected. It would take a fire, a desperate woman's confession, and a ledger that should have stayed lost forever. But before we can understand the network that stole these children, we must understand the world that created it. A world where human beings were property. Where fortunes were built on suffering, and where the color of a child's skin could determine whether they lived enslaved or free. New Orleans in the 1840s was a city of contradictions, a place where French elegance collided with American ambition, where opera houses stood blocks from slave markets, and where fortunes were made and lost on the backs of human beings treated as property. The city had become the wealthiest in the South, its prosperity built entirely on cotton, sugar, and the labor of enslaved people, who outnumbered free whites in many parishes. By 1840, the port of New Orleans was the 4th busiest in the world, with ships arriving daily from Europe, the Caribbean, and the American interior. Cotton bales stacked 20 feet high lined the wharves, waiting for vessels bound for Liverpool and Le Havre. Sugar barrels filled warehouses from the French Quarter to the American sector. And in the markets near the river, human beings stood on auction blocks, sold to the highest bidder while their families watched helplessly. Since the Louisiana Purchase, the city's population had exploded. French Creoles, who had dominated the city for generations, now shared space with American businessmen, Irish and German immigrants, free people of color who formed their own distinct community, and the enslaved population that made all of it possible. The streets echoed with a babel of French, English, Spanish, German, and various African dialects. The architecture reflected this mixture: Spanish colonial buildings with wrought iron balconies, French townhouses with hidden courtyards, and newer American structures built in the Greek Revival style sweeping the nation. But beneath the surface glamour, New Orleans was a city built on a foundation of violence and exploitation. The Code Noir, established under French rule, had been modified but not eliminated under American governance. It regulated every aspect of enslaved people's lives: what they could wear, where they could go, whom they could marry, how they could be punished. The city had a reputation for being more lenient than other southern cities, allowing enslaved people to hire out their own time and sometimes purchase their freedom. But this reputation obscured the brutal reality most enslaved people faced. St. Charles Parish, just upriver from the city, was home to some of Louisiana's most profitable sugar plantations. Known as the German Coast, it had produced sugar since the late 1700s. By the 1840s, plantation owners there had refined their operations into ruthlessly efficient machines. The Dufour Plantation, the Haddle Estate, the Fournier Holdings, the Becknell property, the Troxler lands, these weren't just farms. They were small kingdoms, each operating with its own rules, economy, and secrets. Sugar cultivation was brutal work, far more dangerous and exhausting than cotton. The cane had to be cut during a narrow harvest window in the fall, then processed immediately before it spoiled. The grinding season ran 24 hours a day for weeks. Enslaved workers labored in shifts around massive iron kettles filled with boiling cane juice in buildings where temperatures could reach 120 degrees. Accidents were common, hands crushed in grinding machinery, bodies scalded by boiling syrup, workers collapsing from exhaustion and heat. The plantation owners who lived in grand houses overlooking these operations were among the wealthiest men in America. They traveled to Europe, sent their children to the finest schools, collected art and rare books, and considered themselves cultured gentlemen. Many genuinely believed slavery was a benevolent institution, that they were caring for people who couldn't care for themselves, that the system was ordained by God and nature. But they also knew, though rarely acknowledged openly, that their wealth depended on absolute control over the people they enslaved. Any crack in that control threatened the entire system. Dr. Augustus Levine had come to New Orleans from Mobile in 1844, a young physician with excellent credentials from a Philadelphia medical school. He was 29, unmarried, and ambitious. He had hoped to establish a practice among the wealthy Creole families in the French Quarter. But like many young doctors, he found the established medical families, the Messiers, the Labattats, the Souls, had those families locked down. So Levine did what many struggling doctors did, he took work where he could find it. Plantation medicine was unglamorous but steady. Wealthy planters needed doctors to keep their enslaved workforce healthy enough to labor, and they paid reasonably well for house calls. It wasn't the prestigious practice Levine had dreamed of, but it was a living. He began making regular rounds to 5 plantations in St. Charles Parish, treating everything from fevers to injuries to childbirths. He kept meticulous records, as he'd been taught in medical school. Every patient, symptom, and treatment went into his ledger. His professors had emphasized the importance of documentation. Medicine was becoming more scientific, more systematic, and good records were essential for understanding disease patterns and treatment outcomes. It was this habit, this compulsive documentation, that would eventually make him dangerous. Levine was not an abolitionist. He'd grown up in the South, and while he found slavery distasteful, he accepted it as an economic reality. He treated enslaved patients with the same professional care he gave white patients, but he did not question the system that made them patients in the first place. He was, in his own mind, simply a doctor doing his job. The enslaved community on these plantations lived under constant surveillance and control. The quarters where they slept were arranged in neat rows designed for maximum oversight. Each cabin housed multiple families, with thin walls offering no privacy. The overseer's house overlooked the quarters, and patrols walked through at night to ensure no one moved without permission. Their movements were restricted by a pass system. Any enslaved person found off the plantation without a written pass could be whipped or worse. Their relationships were monitored. Their children were often sold away before adolescence. The women, in particular, lived under a specific terror the men did not face, the knowledge that their bodies were not their own, that they could be used by white men with absolute impunity, and that any children born from such violence would be enslaved from their first breath. This was not a secret. Everyone knew it happened. The light-skinned children working in plantation houses, serving at the master's table, were visible evidence. But it was never discussed openly. White families maintained the fiction that these children resulted from relationships between enslaved people, even when the children looked exactly like the plantation owner or his sons. But something strange was happening on these plantations. Something even the enslaved women themselves did not fully understand at first. The children being born weren't just light-skinned. They were white, completely, unmistakably white. And they were disappearing. In March 1846, Levine was called to the Dufour plantation to attend a woman named Celeste, in labor with her first child. The message came in the middle of the night, delivered by a young enslaved boy who had run 3 miles from the plantation to Levine's New Orleans boarding house. The boy was breathless and frightened, saying only that Celeste was having a difficult labor and the midwife needed help. Levine gathered his bag and rode out through darkness. The road followed the river, passing through groves of live oaks draped with Spanish moss. The air was thick with the smell of the river and the sweet, cloying scent of sugar processing. In the distance, lights of other plantation houses scattered along the river like lanterns in the darkness. He arrived at the Dufour plantation just before dawn. The main house was dark, but lights burned in the quarters. An elderly enslaved woman named Ruth met him at a cabin door. She was the plantation's primary midwife, a woman who had delivered hundreds of children over her 60-some years. Her face was deeply lined, her hands gnarled with arthritis, but her eyes were sharp and assessing. "She's been laboring since yesterday afternoon," Ruth said quietly, leading Levine inside. "Baby's positioned wrong. I can't turn it." Inside, the cabin was stifling despite the cool March night. A fire burned in a small fireplace, heating water in a large pot. Celeste lay on a narrow bed, her face slick with sweat, her body rigid with pain. She was 22, dark-skinned, and had been born on the plantation. This was her first child, and she was terrified. Levine examined her quickly, professionally. Ruth was right, the baby was breech. He would have to turn it manually, a delicate and dangerous procedure. He had done it before, but not often, and the risk of losing both mother and child was high. He worked for 2 hours with Ruth assisting and Celeste biting down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. The overseer, a man named Garrett, came by once to check on progress, then left. The plantation owner, John Baptiste Dufour, never appeared. The birth of an enslaved child was beneath his notice. Finally, just after midnight, Levine managed to turn the baby. Celeste pushed through 3 more contractions, and the child was born, a healthy baby girl with strong lungs and good color. But when Levine cleaned and examined the infant, a cold confusion settled over him. The child was pale, not light brown, not mixed race in appearance, but genuinely pale, with skin the color of cream and eyes that would clearly be blue once they focused. Her features were delicate, European. Everything about her suggested white ancestry, and recent white ancestry at that. He looked at Celeste, then back at the infant. Celeste's face was unreadable, a mask of exhaustion and something else. Fear, perhaps, or resignation. She would not meet his eyes. "The father?" Levine asked quietly, though he already suspected. Celeste did not respond. Ruth, cleaning the afterbirth, simply shook her head in a way that told Levine not to ask again. He recorded the birth in his ledger, noting the time, the difficulty of delivery, and the child's condition. Then he added a line that would later seem prophetic, * female infant delivered to Celeste. Property of J. Dufour. Healthy. Unusual presentation. Child appears white in complexion and features. Father unknown. *. He left the cabin as the sun was rising, exhausted and troubled. He had delivered children to enslaved women before, including clearly mixed-race children. But this was different. This child could pass for white in any setting. 3 days later, when Levine returned to check on Celeste's recovery, the child was gone. Celeste sat on her cabin porch, staring at nothing. Her breasts were bound tightly, and she moved stiffly, as if in pain. "Where's the baby?" Levine asked. Celeste did not answer. She just kept staring. Levine found the overseer, Garrett, near the sugar mill. "The infant I delivered to Celeste. Where is she?" Garrett barely looked up from the ledger he was reviewing. "Died in the night. Weak constitution. We buried her already." "Died of what?" Levine asked, a prickle of unease spreading. "Weak constitution," Garrett repeated flatly. "Happens all the time with these people. They're not as hardy as whites. You know that." But Levine had examined that child. She had been perfectly healthy, strong lungs, good color, normal reflexes, stable temperature. There was no reason she should have died. "I'd like to examine the body," Levine said. Garrett finally looked up, his expression hardening. "Body's buried. No point digging it up. You got paid for the delivery, didn't you? That's all you need to worry about." Levine wanted to press the issue, but something in Garrett's tone warned him off. He noted the death in his ledger, but he did not believe it. That night, lying in his rented room, he kept thinking about the child's face, Celeste's blank expression, the overseer's too quick dismissal. Something was wrong. He just did not know what yet. 2 months later, it happened again. This time on the Haddle plantation, a woman named Josephine delivered a boy who looked exactly like the first child, pale, light-eyed, with fine features that would have fit perfectly in any white family's portrait. Levine delivered the child on a humid May evening, thunderstorms rolling in from the Gulf. The air in the cabin was thick and close, and Josephine screamed through her labor with a desperate fury that unsettled him. Josephine was older than Celeste, perhaps 30, and this was her 4th child. Her other 3, all darker-skinned, clearly of African descent, had been sold away over the years. She told Levine this matter-of-factly during his examination, as if it were simply a fact of life, which for her it was. When the child was born, Josephine would not look at it. She turned her face to the wall and wept silently while Ruth cleaned the infant. "Josephine," Levine said gently, "your son is healthy. Don't you want to hold him?" "Just take it away," Josephine whispered. Ruth wrapped the child and handed him to the overseer waiting outside. The man took the infant without comment and disappeared into darkness. Levine stood there, medical bag in hand, feeling he had witnessed something profoundly wrong but unable to articulate exactly what. He had delivered dozens of children to enslaved women by then and had seen the full range of emotions: joy, sorrow, fear, love. But this was different. This was rejection, born of something deeper than postpartum distress. He recorded the birth with the same notation, * male infant delivered to Josephine. Property of a Haddle. Healthy. Unusual presentation. Child appears white in complexion and features. Father unknown. *. When he returned a week later, he was told the child had died. Again, no body to examine. Again, a burial already completed. How did he die? Levine asked the overseer, a different man than Garrett, but with the same hard face and dismissive manner. Fever took him quick, the man said. Nothing to be done. But the child had been perfectly healthy when Levine left him, no fever, no signs of illness. That night, Levine sat in his room and reviewed his ledger by candlelight. 2 births, 2 healthy infants, 2 deaths within days, both children with the same impossible appearance. He thought about how Josephine had turned away, how Celeste had looked at him with that unreadable expression. He thought about the overseers who took the children so quickly, the convenient deaths, the hasty burials. He thought about how both plantation owners, Dufour and Haddle, were known to visit the quarters at night. Everyone knew, though no one spoke of it openly. Something was very wrong. Over the next year, Levine delivered 12 more children with the same characteristics, 12 pale infants born to dark-skinned enslaved women, 12 children who vanished within days. All officially recorded as dead from various causes: fever, weak constitution, failure to thrive, respiratory distress. But Levine had been trained to recognize patterns, and this pattern defied medical explanation. Infant mortality was high among enslaved populations, yes. Poor nutrition, inadequate housing, and limited medical care contributed to death rates 2 or 3 times higher than among white infants. But not like this. Not with this specific profile. Not with children born healthy and dying within days, always without a body available, and always buried before Levine could return. He began asking careful questions. He spoke to Ruth, but she would only shake her head and tell him to leave it alone. "You don't want to know," she said once when he pressed. "Trust me, doctor. You don't want to know." "But the children." "The children are gone," Ruth interrupted. "That's all you need to understand. They're gone, and asking questions won't bring them back. It'll only bring trouble to you." He tried to speak to the mothers, but they would not meet his eyes. When asked about their children, they simply said the child had died, repeating it like a rehearsed line. Their faces were blank, their voices flat, as if trained to give this response. The overseers grew increasingly hostile. One, a man named Dupree on the Fournier plantation, took Levine aside after he'd asked about a child who'd supposedly died. "Listen, doctor," Dupree said, his voice low and threatening. "You're here to deliver babies and treat the sick. That's all. You're not here to ask questions about what happens after. You understand me? I'm just concerned about the high mortality rate. The mortality rate is none of your concern, Dupree interrupted. These people have weak constitutions. Their babies die. That's just how it is. Now you can accept that and keep getting paid, or you can keep asking questions and find yourself without work. Your choice. Levine stopped asking questions openly, but he kept documenting. Every birth, every description, every suspicious death went into his ledger. He began noticing other patterns, too. The births always happened at night. Overseers were always present, waiting outside. Mothers were always alone afterward. No family members allowed to visit. No other enslaved people permitted to see the child. And the children were always taken by the overseer, never left with the mother even for a few hours. In September 1847, he delivered his 47th such child, a girl born to a woman named Marie on the Fournier plantation. The child was perhaps the palest yet, with hair that would clearly be blonde and eyes already showing hints of green. Marie was different, younger, perhaps 19, born in Haiti and brought to Louisiana after the Revolution. She spoke French with a Caribbean accent and had a fierce intelligence in her eyes that hadn't been beaten down. She held her daughter for exactly 3 minutes, whispering something in French Levine could not quite hear. Then she looked directly at him, tears streaming. "Please," Marie said in English, accent thick but words clear. "Please write it down. Write down what you see. Someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember that she existed, that she was mine, that she was real." Levine felt something shift in his chest. "I will," he promised. "I've been writing it all down." Marie nodded, then handed her daughter to the overseer with a look of such profound grief that Levine had to turn away. That was the moment Levine decided he had to act. He could not prove what was happening, but he could document it. He could create a record that could not be ignored. He could force someone in authority to investigate. He spent 3 days compiling his evidence: 47 births, 47 descriptions, 47 convenient deaths. He noted dates, plantations, overseers, mothers. He wrote a careful letter explaining his concerns and requesting an investigation into what he termed irregularities in infant mortality rates among the enslaved population of St. Charles Parish, specifically regarding infants of unusually pale complexion. He was careful not to make accusations. He simply presented facts and asked for someone to look into the matter. He thought if he approached it as a medical concern rather than a moral one, he might get a hearing. On October 3, 1847, he presented his findings to the parish magistrate, Judge Beaumont, a Creole gentleman in his 60s, educated in France, known for careful adherence to the law. If anyone would take this seriously, Levine thought, it would be him. Beaumont received him in his courthouse office, a Spanish colonial building with thick walls and high ceilings. The judge sat behind a massive mahogany desk, face impassive as Levine explained. Then he handed over the copied ledger pages. Beaumont read in silence, only the ticking of a clock and rustle of paper. When finished, he carefully stacked the pages, aligned their edges, and set them down. Then he looked at Levine with an expression not quite anger, not sympathy, but closer to pity. "Dr. Levine," Beaumont said slowly, "I'm going to give you some advice. Go back to your practice. Deliver the babies you're called to deliver. Keep your records if you must, but do not pursue this matter further." "But the children." "The children are property," Beaumont interrupted, his voice hardening. "What happens to them is the business of their owners, not yours, not mine, not the law's. Do you understand?" Levine felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Are you telling me these infants aren't dying? That they're being taken somewhere?" Beaumont stood, signaling the meeting's end. "I'm telling you there are systems in place far larger than you or me, and interfering with those systems would be very dangerous for you. These plantations generate enormous wealth for this parish, this state, the entire South. The men who own them are powerful, and they do not take kindly to interference in their affairs. But if children are being enslaved, children are property," Beaumont repeated, voice cold. "They can be sold, traded, given away, or disposed of as their owners see fit. That is the law. If you don't like the law, I suggest you move to Massachusetts. But as long as you practice medicine in Louisiana, you will abide by Louisiana law. Do I make myself clear? Levine stared, understanding finally dawning. Beaumont knew. He knew what was happening, and he was part of it, or at least protecting those who were. Perfectly clear, Levine said quietly. He left the courthouse with his copied pages, feeling sick. He had been naive to think evidence would bring justice. The system wasn't designed for justice, it was designed to protect property and profit. Enslaved people, including children, were property. But Levine could not forget. That night, he made a second copy of his ledger pages and hid them in his room, sewn into his mattress lining. The original he kept with him in a leather portfolio he carried everywhere. He also wrote a letter to his sister in Mobile, a sister who had died of yellow fever when Levine was 12, a fact anyone investigating him would quickly discover. In the letter, he detailed everything he'd learned and suspected. He described the network, named people involved, explained his fears for his safety. Then he sealed it and hid it in his ledger between pages documenting births 32 and 33. 2 weeks later, he received a message that his services were no longer required on any St. Charles Parish plantations. No explanation. The message was delivered by a clerk from Judge Beaumont's office, and it was clearly not a request. Levine's income dropped by more than half. He tried to find other work, but word spread he was troublesome, asked too many questions. Other plantation owners would not hire him. His city practice remained small. 3 weeks after that, on October 27, 1847, Dr. Augustus Levine left his boarding house to meet a colleague for dinner in the French Quarter. He carried his leather portfolio as always. He never arrived. His body was found the next morning, caught in pilings beneath a Mississippi River dock. The official cause, accidental drowning, likely due to intoxication. A whiskey bottle was found nearby, and witnesses reported seeing a man matching Levine's description drinking alone at a tavern earlier. His medical bag was found nearby, contents scattered. His leather portfolio was gone. His landlady, questioned by police, said she'd seen 2 well-dressed men leaving his room the night he died. They told her they were colleagues collecting his belongings for his family. She thought nothing of it, they were polite, well-spoken, and gave her $1 for her trouble. When police searched Levine's room, they found it thoroughly cleaned out. Clothes remained, but all papers were gone. Medical books were on the shelf, but loose documents removed. The mattress was slit open, lining torn out. The hidden copy of his ledger pages was never found. Either the men were thorough, or the landlady disposed of it, not understanding what it was. Dr. Augustus Levine was buried in St. Louis Cemetery No. 2 in an unmarked grave in the section for paupers and strangers. He had no family in New Orleans to claim his body or possessions. His few belongings were sold to pay outstanding rent. Within a month, it was as if he had never existed. But the births continued. In the years following Levine's death, the phenomenon he documented did not stop, it accelerated across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Enslaved women kept giving birth to children who looked white, and those children kept disappearing. The enslaved community knew, even if they could not speak openly. They had their own information networks, whispered conversations in quarters after dark, warnings passed from plantation to plantation by enslaved people hired out or sent on errands. The women who'd given birth to these pale children carried a specific grief, a loss different from having a child sold away. These children weren't just gone, they'd been erased, transformed into something else. The mothers knew, though never allowed, that their children were out there somewhere, living as white, never knowing their origins. Because that was what was actually happening. They weren't dying. They were being sold as white children. The system was breathtakingly simple and absolutely monstrous. Plantation owners who fathered children with enslaved women, common, openly acknowledged but never discussed, faced a problem. These children were legally enslaved, property like their mothers. But if they looked white, with no visible trace of African ancestry, they were embarrassing reminders of the rape and exploitation at slavery's heart. They complicated the racial hierarchy the entire Southern economy depended on. A child who looked white but was legally enslaved raised uncomfortable questions. If this child could be enslaved, what did that say about supposed natural racial differences? If white-appearing children could be born to enslaved mothers, didn't that suggest racial categories were more fluid than anyone wanted to admit? But these children were also valuable. A healthy white child could be sold for 10 times what an enslaved infant would bring. And if the child looked white enough, who would ever know? So a network developed, doctors, midwives, lawyers, traders specializing in this transaction. Children were taken within days of birth, before mothers formed attachments, before anyone outside saw them. False death certificates were filed. Infants were transported to cities, New Orleans, Mobile, Charleston, Richmond, placed with white families who wanted children but couldn't have them, or were willing to look the other way about origins for a lower price than legal adoption. The network had existed since slavery's earliest days in Louisiana but became more organized and sophisticated by the 1840s. Specific people handled each stage. First, plantation owners and overseers identified which children could pass as white. Not every mixed-race child qualified, only those pale enough, with European features and straight hair texture. Second, doctors and midwives facilitated births and provided false death certificates. Most were like Levine initially, suspected something but didn't ask questions because they needed work. A few were active participants, paid for cooperation. Third, transporters moved children from plantations to cities. They traveled with forged papers claiming infants were their own children or orphans. Children were often drugged with laudanum to keep quiet. Fourth, lawyers created false documentation, birth certificates, baptismal records, family Bibles with backdated entries to make everything look legitimate. They were skilled forgers who knew exactly what documents were needed. Fifth, brokers connected children with families willing to buy. They operated from city offices, presenting as private adoption facilitators. They charged enormous fees, sometimes $500 per child, a year's wages for most working people. Finally, families bought the children. Some genuinely believed they were adopting orphans. Others knew exactly what they were buying and didn't care. They wanted children, had money, and were willing to look away. The entire network was protected by a wall of silence. Plantation owners had every incentive to keep quiet. They were disposing of evidence of their own crimes. Mothers couldn't speak without risking punishment or death. Buyers wanted to believe children were legitimate. The children themselves had no memory of origins. It was, in its way, a perfect crime. The only evidence was in records, and those could be destroyed or altered. The only witnesses were enslaved people whose testimony would never be accepted in court. The only person who tried to expose it, Dr. Levine, had been silenced permanently. The system might have continued indefinitely if not for a woman named Henriette Delacroix. Henriette was a free woman of color, a rarity in 1850s Louisiana. Her mother had been enslaved by a wealthy French Creole merchant, Philippe Delacroix, who freed her in his will and left a small inheritance. Henriette was born free, raised in New Orleans, educated by tutors. In 1853, she was 32, unmarried, working as a seamstress with a shop in the French Quarter, known for skill with delicate fabrics and intricate embroidery. She lived modestly above her shop, maintained careful respectability, and navigated New Orleans' complex social world with the caution all free people of color had to exercise. Free people of color occupied a strange middle ground, not enslaved, but not equal to whites. They could own property, run businesses, even own enslaved people themselves. But they couldn't vote, serve on juries, or testify against whites in court. They had to carry free papers at all times and could be enslaved if papers were lost or challenged. Henriette had a younger sister, Margot, 27 in 1853. Margot had been born free and worked as a music teacher, giving piano lessons to free people of color and occasionally white families willing to overlook her race for her talent. But in spring 1853, Margot's life was destroyed by a legal technicality. A distant relative of Philippe Delacroix, Armand Delacroix in France, who had never met Philippe, challenged the manumission papers that had freed Henriette's mother. He claimed Philippe had no legal right to free an enslaved person in his will without heir's consent, so the manumission was invalid. The case went to court. Henriette hired the best lawyer she could afford, Victor Sewell, a free man of color who had studied law in France. Sewell argued passionately that the manumission had been legal under laws at the time. Philippe was of sound mind, and challenging it 30 years later was unconscionable. But the judge, the same Judge Beaumont who dismissed Levine's concerns 6 years earlier, ruled for Armand Delacroix. He declared the manumission improperly granted, so Henriette's mother had never been legally free. If the mother was never free, her children, born to an enslaved woman, were also enslaved. Overnight, Margot went from free woman with a future to property. Henriette, as older daughter, should have been enslaved too, but Armand's lawyer calculated enslaving one sister would be profitable, enslaving both would create too much attention, sympathy, risk of public outcry. So they took Margot and left Henriette free, knowing the threat of enslavement would keep her quiet. Margot was sold at auction 3 days after the ruling. Henriette stood in the crowd and watched her sister put on the block, examined like livestock, sold to a St. Charles Parish plantation owner for $800. The buyer was Claude Fournier, owner of one of the largest sugar plantations on the German coast. Henriette fought through every legal channel, but the law was clear: enslaved people had no rights whites were bound to respect. The technicality made Margot's enslavement legal. Sewell tried everything: appeals, petitions, raising money to purchase Margot's freedom, but Fournier refused. He paid good money and intended to get value from her labor. In fall 1854, Henriette received word through the enslaved network that Margot was pregnant. The father, according to whispers, was Claude Fournier himself. Henriette felt sick with rage and helplessness. In January 1855, Margot gave birth to a daughter. Henriette, using her free status and claiming to bring supplies for the enslaved community, bribed an overseer with $10 for an hour alone with Margot. The cabin was identical to all others: single room, dirt floor, small fireplace, narrow bed. Margot sat on the bed holding her daughter. When Henriette entered, she began weeping. "Look at her," Margot whispered. "Look at her, Henriette." The child was pale, with features that could pass for white, Fournier's nose, chin, light eyes. She was beautiful and doomed. "They're going to take her," Margot said. "I heard them talking, Fournier and the overseer. They said she's too pale, can't stay here. They're going to take her away and say she died." Henriette held her niece for an hour, memorizing every detail: tiny fingers, soft hair, small sounds in sleep. She whispered promises she knew she couldn't keep, told the child about her mother's real life, the music and freedom that should have been hers. 3 days later, Henriette received word the child had died of fever. But she knew it was a lie. She knew her niece was alive somewhere, being sold to a white family, erased from existence. And she decided she couldn't let it stand. She couldn't save her niece, but she could expose what was happening. So she began to investigate. She used connections in the free black community, relationships with enslaved people working in white households, access to white spaces as a seamstress entering wealthy homes. She asked careful questions, listened to rumors, pieced together fragments that individually meant nothing but together formed a pattern. It took 2 years to understand. 2 years gathering evidence, tracking down women who'd lost pale children, finding midwives and doctors who facilitated transfers, identifying lawyers who forged documents and brokers who sold children. She learned about the network in detail: how it operated, who was involved, how much money changed hands. She discovered it wasn't just Louisiana. The practice extended across the entire South. Anywhere enslaved women gave birth to children who could pass as white. She found evidence of children sent to California, Texas, even Europe. And in summer 1856, she found her niece. The child was living with a wealthy white family in the Garden District, raised as their daughter. Her name was now Charlotte Beaumont, same last name as the judge who ruled against Margot's freedom and dismissed Levine's concerns. She was 18 months old, healthy, with no idea her mother was enslaved upriver, grieving a child she'd been told was dead. Henriette stood across from the Beaumont house, watching Charlotte play in the garden with her nurse. The house was a Greek Revival mansion with massive white columns, garden full of roses and camellias. Charlotte chased a ball across the lawn, laughing while the nurse followed. She wore a white linen dress with pink ribbons, hair tied with a matching bow. Henriette felt something break inside her chest. This child, her niece, her sister's daughter, would grow up in luxury, never knowing her origins. She would be raised white, marry white, have white children. The connection to Margot would be severed completely, and Margot would spend life enslaved, grieving a daughter alive but might as well be dead. Henriette couldn't reclaim Charlotte. The law wouldn't allow it. Even if she could prove origins, and she had no legal proof, only enslaved people's word not accepted in court, it would only result in Charlotte being re-enslaved, not returned to Margot. The system was designed to prevent such revelations. But Henriette could expose it. She could make people see. She could create a record that couldn't be ignored. She began documenting everything. She wrote names, dates, locations. She tracked down other children sold into white families, found 12 in New Orleans alone, suspected dozens more across the South. She interviewed mothers who'd lost children, recorded their stories in detail. She spoke to midwives pressured to provide false death certificates. She found a doctor who'd been part of the network but grew disgusted and would talk if his name wasn't used. She compiled a damning dossier. It named plantation owners, lawyers, brokers, families who'd bought children. It described the process from beginning to end. It estimated hundreds of children had been stolen and sold as white over 2 decades. In March 1857, she took her evidence to Thomas Whitfield, editor of a small abolitionist paper, *The Liberator's Voice*, operating on legality's edge. Whitfield was a white man from Pennsylvania who moved to New Orleans in 1855, driven by commitment to ending slavery. His paper was constantly under threat of being shut down. He'd been arrested twice for incendiary material. Whitfield read Henriette's documentation with growing horror. When finished, he sat back and stared. "If we publish this," he said slowly, "they'll shut us down. They might do worse. They killed that doctor, didn't they? The one you mentioned." "Yes," Henriette said. "They killed him, and they'll kill me if they find out what I know. But someone has to tell the truth. These children deserve to have their stories told. Their mothers deserve to be acknowledged." Whitfield was quiet a long moment. Then he nodded. "Give me 2 weeks to verify what I can. I'll send someone to check parish records, see if death certificates match your information. Then we'll run it. Front page. The whole story." But they never got the chance. On March 15, 1857, 6 days before Whitfield's paper was scheduled to publish Henriette's exposé, a fire broke out in the building housing his printing press. The fire started at 2 a.m. when no one should have been in, burned hot and fast with intensity suggesting accelerants. By the time volunteer fire brigade arrived, the structure was engulfed. The building was in the American sector near docks, an area of warehouses and workshops. The fire spread to 2 adjacent buildings, destroying a cooperage and tobacco warehouse. Thomas Whitfield's body was found in ruins next morning. He'd apparently returned to the office late. Neighbors reported seeing a light around midnight. He'd been trapped. His body was so badly burned he could only be identified by his watch, a distinctive silver piece his wife recognized. The official investigation concluded a lamp had been knocked over, igniting paper and printing chemicals. Ruled accidental death, case closed within a week. All Whitfield's files were destroyed, including everything Henriette had given him. Henriette herself disappeared 3 days after the fire. Her shop was found locked, apartment empty, clothes in wardrobe, dishes in cupboard, but she was gone. The money she kept hidden under floorboards, nearly $200, her life savings, was gone too. Some said she'd fled north, terrified whoever killed Whitfield would come for her next. Others whispered she'd met Levine's fate, body dumped in the river never found. A few suggested she'd been enslaved like her sister and sold away. The truth was more complicated. Henriette had been warned. The morning after the fire, she found a note slipped under her door, expensive paper, educated hand, no threats, no explanations, just 4 words, * leave now or die. *. She took it seriously. She packed a small bag with clothes, money, and a second copy of her documentation. She'd learned from Levine's mistake and made copies of everything. She walked out of New Orleans that same day, leaving everything else. She made her way north through an abolitionist and free black network, moving from safe house to safe house, never staying anywhere long enough to be traced. She traveled by riverboat to Memphis, overland to Louisville, train to Cincinnati, then north to Cleveland, east to Philadelphia. By summer 1857, Henriette was in Philadelphia, using the name Henriette Du Bois, trying to build a new life where no one knew her history. She found work as a seamstress again, starting over, building a new clientele from nothing. But she couldn't let go of what she'd learned. She couldn't forget Charlotte, Margot, the dozens of other children stolen and transformed. She couldn't stop thinking about mothers still grieving, living with knowledge their children were alive somewhere but lost forever. She tried to interest northern newspapers, but they focused on bigger battles, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, growing North-South tensions leading toward war. The story of enslaved children sold as white was too specific, complicated, easy to dismiss as unverifiable rumor. Do you have proof? Editors would ask. Documents? Witnesses who will testify? She had documents, but copies of destroyed records. She had witnesses, but enslaved people whose testimony wouldn't be accepted. She had her own observations, but she was a black woman, her word alone wasn't enough. But Henriette kept trying. She refined documentation, tracked more cases, built a more comprehensive picture. She learned it wasn't just Louisiana, the practice extended across the entire South. She discovered some children were sent as far as California, where the gold rush created a population boom and desperate need for labor and families. She found cases of children shipped to Europe, sold to wealthy families who wanted American children but didn't want legal adoption complexities. The network was vast, sophisticated, protected by people at the highest Southern society levels, judges, lawyers, doctors, plantation owners. They all had a stake in keeping it hidden, and power to silence anyone threatening exposure. In 1858, Henriette finally found someone willing to help, Rebecca Morris, a Quaker abolitionist in her 50s, a widow devoted to the cause. Rebecca was part of a Quaker network documenting slavery's horrors for a book to be published in London beyond Southern legal reach. The book intended to sway British public opinion against slavery and pressure the British government to support American abolition. This isn't just about slavery, Rebecca said, sitting in her Philadelphia parlor with Henriette's papers spread. This is about the lie at the system's heart. They claim race is fixed, you can look at someone and know ancestry, white and black separate and distinct categories ordained by God and nature. But if enslaved children can be sold as white, if they can grow up and have white children and no one ever knows difference, then the whole racial hierarchy is fiction. Exactly, Henriette said. That's why they'll kill to keep it secret. Because if people understand race isn't fixed, that it can be changed or hidden or manipulated, then the entire justification for slavery falls apart. Rebecca convinced Henriette to include the story in the documentation. They worked months refining narrative, verifying details, preparing manuscript. Rebecca had connections to sympathetic British publishers and was confident the book would be published and widely distributed. But even as they worked, the network adapted. Word spread about Henriette's investigation, the near miss with Whitfield's newspaper, the documentation nearly published. People running the operation became more careful, moved children farther away, destroyed records more thoroughly, eliminated anyone asking too many questions. In St. Charles Parish, births continued, but children disappeared even faster, within hours instead of days. Mothers were sometimes sold away immediately after birth, scattered to plantations across the South where they couldn't compare stories or organize resistance. The system tightened, became more efficient and brutal. The network learned from near exposure and took steps to ensure it would never be threatened again. Then the Civil War began, and everything changed. The war changed everything and nothing. The child trafficking network continued even as armies marched, plantations burned, enslaved people fled to Union lines. In some ways, chaos made it easier, records destroyed in fighting, families displaced, and in confusion, a pale child could be moved with even less scrutiny. But the war also created new problems. Union forces occupying Louisiana investigated reports of irregularities in plantation records. Freedmen's Bureau agents tasked with reuniting families separated by slavery asked questions about children who'd supposedly died but were never properly documented. In 1863, Union Captain James Hartwell was assigned to investigate reports of missing children in St. Charles Parish. Hartwell was from Massachusetts, a former lawyer who joined the Army from abolitionist conviction. 35, married with 2 children in Boston, he took the assignment seriously because he understood slavery wasn't just about labor, it was about systematic destruction of families and identities. He began reviewing parish records, birth certificates, death certificates, property transfers. He spent weeks in the Hanville courthouse going through dusty ledgers and document boxes. He noticed the same pattern Levine documented 16 years earlier: unusually high infant deaths among enslaved populations with almost no bodies available and no clear causes. Death certificates were suspiciously uniform, fever most common, then weak constitution, failure to thrive. No details, symptom descriptions, treatment records, just name, date, cause. Hartwell cross-referenced death certificates with plantation records and found more irregularities. In several cases, children who'd supposedly died were still listed in plantation inventories months or years later, suggesting records altered or different children recorded under same names. He interviewed formerly enslaved people who'd fled to Union lines. Many were reluctant, afraid speaking about children would endanger them further. But slowly, Hartwell pieced together the story. An elderly woman named Ruth, the same Ruth who assisted Levine, told him everything. She was dying of consumption, coughing blood into a handkerchief as she spoke, and said she wanted someone to know truth before she passed. "I helped deliver more than 200 babies in my life," Ruth said, voice barely above whisper. "And I watched dozens disappear. The pale ones, the ones who looked white. They'd be born, I'd clean and wrap them, and then the overseer would take them away. The mothers would cry, but there was nothing they could do. Nothing any of us could do." "Where did the children go?" Hartwell asked. "I don't know for certain," Ruth said. "But I heard things. Overseers would talk sometimes when they thought we couldn't hear. They'd talk about families in the city who wanted children, lawyers who could make papers, how much money each child was worth, hundreds of dollars sometimes. More than I'd ever seen." "Do you remember any names? Any specific people involved?" Ruth named names: plantation owners, overseers, a doctor who replaced Levine after he died, a New Orleans lawyer specializing in private adoptions. She provided dates, described the process as she understood it, told Hartwell about mothers still alive, still grieving babies they'd been told were dead. "They took hundreds of children," Ruth told Hartwell. "Hundreds. And those children are out there somewhere, living as white, never knowing where they came from. Their mothers are still alive, some still grieving, still wondering if their babies are safe, if they're loved, if they ever think about women who birthed them." Hartwell was horrified. He immediately began compiling a report for superiors, documenting what he'd learned and recommending full investigation. He wanted to track down children, reunite them with mothers if possible, prosecute people running the network. But before submitting, he received orders transferring him to Virginia. The transfer was sudden, unexpected, with a clear message from his commanding officer: drop the investigation. "There are bigger battles to fight," Colonel Morrison told him when Hartwell protested. "We're trying to win a war and hold the Union together. We can't afford to open something this complicated now." "But the children." "The children are gone," Morrison interrupted. "Scattered across the country, living new lives. What do you think happens if you expose this? You'll destroy families, ruin lives, create chaos, and for what? You can't undo what's been done. You can't give those children back original identities. They're white now, for all practical purposes. Leave it alone. But the people who did this should be prosecuted. For what? Morrison asked. For selling property they legally owned? For forging documents? You think any court will convict wealthy white men for crimes against enslaved people? Even if we win this war, even if we abolish slavery, you think anyone will care about a few hundred children? Hartwell wanted to argue, but understood political calculation. The Union needed moderate Northerners' support, people willing to fight to preserve the Union but not necessarily committed to racial equality. A scandal involving white families unknowingly adopting enslaved children would be politically explosive. It would raise questions about racial identity, family legitimacy, the entire social order. It was easier to let it go, pretend it hadn't happened, focus on war and leave complicated questions for later. So the investigation was quietly shelved. Hartwell was sent to Virginia, served with distinction another year. He was killed at Cold Harbor in June 1864, shot through chest leading a charge against Confederate entrenchments. His notes about missing children were packed with personal effects and sent to his Boston family, where they sat in an attic decades, unread and forgotten. Ruth died 2 weeks after speaking with Hartwell. Buried in a mass grave with other formerly enslaved people who died in contraband camps. Her name recorded in a ledger eventually lost. The war ended. Slavery abolished. The Freedmen's Bureau worked to reunite families, but focused on people sold away, not children stolen and transformed. Mothers who'd lost pale children had no legal recourse, no way to prove what happened, no means of finding children even if they wanted to, and most didn't. What would be the point? Their children were white now, living white lives. Revealing truth would only destroy them, mark them black in a society becoming more rigidly segregated, strip them of social status, marriages, futures. So mothers kept silent. They grieved privately, carried losses alone, never spoke about children taken from them. The network dissolved gradually as slavery ended and legal framework protecting it disappeared. But children remained, scattered across country, origins hidden. Some eventually learned truth, a deathbed confession from adoptive parent, a discovered letter, chance encounter with someone who knew story. But most never knew. They lived and died believing they were white, and their children and grandchildren never had reason to question. Margot, Henriette's sister, was freed when war ended. She stayed on Fournier Plantation as paid laborer a few years, having nowhere else to go, no family to return to. Henriette sent letters trying to find her, but they never connected, mail system chaotic post-war South, letters often went astray. In 1870, Margot died of pneumonia. 44 years old. She'd never remarried, never had other children, spent last 15 years grieving daughter taken from her. Buried in small cemetery near plantation, grave marked with simple wooden cross rotted away within few years. She never learned her daughter lived, that Charlotte grew up in wealthy white family just miles away in New Orleans, raised with every advantage, educated at finest schools, introduced to society as Judge Beaumont's daughter. Charlotte Beaumont, the same Charlotte Henriette found in Garden District 20 years earlier, died in childbirth in New Orleans in 1879. 25 years old, married to wealthy merchant Edward Clark, never knowing her mother was enslaved woman Margot who died on plantation in 1870, still grieving daughter she held 3 hours. Charlotte's death mourned by New Orleans society. Buried in prominent tomb in Metairie Cemetery, marble angel marking grave. Her *Picayune obituary described her as beloved daughter of one of our city's most distinguished families, taken from us too soon. Charlotte's children, 2 daughters, 3 and 5, grew up white, married white, had white children. The secret died with generation that created it. Or so everyone thought. Henriette Delacroix lived until 1889, dying in Philadelphia at 68. She never stopped documenting cases of stolen children, even knowing her work would likely never bring justice. She never married, never had children, devoted last 30 years to creating a record of what happened. Her papers, discovered after death by Quaker community supporting her, contained records of over 300 cases across 7 southern states. She documented births, disappearances, fates of children she'd been able to track. She created a genealogy of stolen identities, a map of families torn apart and reassembled in new configurations. The Quakers preserved her papers, recognizing historical significance. Eventually donated to Library Company of Philadelphia, where they sat in archives, occasionally consulted by historians but never widely publicized. The story might have remained buried if not for events beginning in 1979, exactly 132 years after Levine's death. Dr. Patricia Jennings was a historian specializing in antebellum Louisiana medical practices. 42, Tulane professor, working on a book about plantation medicine. She'd been researching in New Orleans municipal archives months, looking through boxes of old documents donated by various families over years. Most was routine, property records, receipts, correspondence, mundane paperwork. But in a box labeled * Beaumont Family Papers, 1840-1880 *, she found something extraordinary, a leather-bound ledger, water-damaged, fragile, pages stuck together and partially illegible. Jennings recognized immediately it was a medical ledger, entries for patients, treatments, fees. As she carefully separated pages, she realized it was more significant, Dr. Augustus Levine's original ledger, the one supposedly disappeared when he died. Jennings spent 3 months carefully separating pages and transcribing what she could read. Water damage destroyed some entries completely, but enough remained to tell story: 47 births, 47 descriptions of pale children born to enslaved women, 47 suspicious deaths. But there was more. Tucked between pages, she found letters, Levine to Judge Beaumont pleading for investigation, Beaumont to Levine warning him to stop, and one final letter dated October 26, 1847, day before Levine's body found in river. The letter addressed to "My dear sister Margaret," though Jennings's research revealed Levine's only sister died in childhood. Clearly a precaution, if intercepted, would appear personal correspondence, not evidence. In the letter, Levine described everything he'd learned. He named plantation owners involved, overseers facilitating transfers, lawyers forging documents. He described network in detail, including that Judge Beaumont himself was primary organizer. I have documented 47 cases Levine wrote, but I believe there are many more. This is not isolated practice, but systematic operation involving some of wealthiest and most powerful men in Louisiana. They are stealing children from mothers and selling them as white, erasing identities and histories for profit. He described his plan: take evidence to a New York newspaper beyond Louisiana law reach. He was leaving New Orleans next day, traveling by steamboat to Memphis, then overland to New York. Already made arrangements with New York Tribune editor who agreed to publish findings. If you're reading this letter concluded, it means they've killed me. But at least truth will survive. These children deserve stories told. Their mothers deserve acknowledged, and men who did this deserve exposed, even if never punished. Jennings sat in archives reading room holding fragile letter, chills down spine. This wasn't just historical curiosity, evidence of massive crime, systematic operation stealing hundreds of children, erasing identities. She immediately researched further. Found records of Levine's death, cursory investigation, quick burial. Found references to Beaumont's career, wealth, prominence. Found property records showing Beaumont owned Garden District House, same house Henriette saw Charlotte playing. And she found adoption records, or absence. In 1850s, Louisiana had no formal adoption laws. Children transferred through private arrangements with minimal documentation, perfect system for hiding stolen children's origins. Jennings published findings in Academic Journal 1981. Article titled "The Hidden Traffic, Child Theft and Racial Passing in Antebellum Louisiana" caused minor sensation in historical circles. Picked up by few newspapers, discussed at conferences, cited in other work, but didn't reach wider audience. Families named in Levine's ledger long gone. Plantation sold and resold. Most dismissed it as tragic but isolated incident, dark chapter safely past. But Jennings kept digging. She traveled to Philadelphia, found Henriette Delacroix's papers in Library Company archives. Tracked down Captain Hartwell's notes in family papers in Boston. Interviewed descendants of enslaved people from St. Charles Parish, some who remembered stories about pale children disappearing. And she began trying to find children, or rather their descendants. Using genealogical records, DNA testing, painstaking historical research, Jennings identified 17 families in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama descended from children sold as white. Some families shocked. Others suspected something but never had proof. A few knew truth generations but kept secret, afraid social consequences. One was the Beaumont family. Judge Beaumont's great-great-granddaughter, Elizabeth Beaumont Clark, 62, retired schoolteacher in Baton Rouge, agreed to speak with Jennings 1985. Elizabeth was white-appearing, pale skin, light brown hair, grew up believing entirely European descent. But her grandmother told different story. My grandmother told me when I was 16, Elizabeth said, sitting in living room with Jennings. She said our family had a secret I needed know before she died. She told me about Charlotte, how she'd been bought as infant, how Judge arranged whole thing. How did you feel when you learned? Jennings asked. Elizabeth quiet long moment, staring out window at garden. I felt my entire identity was lie, she finally said. I'd grown up thinking I knew who I was, where from. Taught family history, French and Spanish ancestors, place in New Orleans society. Then learned my great-great-grandmother enslaved, stolen from mother, everything told about family history false. Did it change how you saw yourself? Yes and no, Elizabeth said. I still looked same. Same memories, relationships. But felt living lie, passing as something wasn't. Didn't know what to do with knowledge. Who's supposed to tell? What supposed to do? Did you ever try to find Charlotte's mother's family? I tried, Elizabeth said. But records destroyed during war. No way trace Margot's descendants. If she had other children, I don't know who. Don't know if have cousins out there black, descended from same woman. Like that part of history just erased. She paused. And I think about Charlotte sometimes, what her life like. Did she ever suspect? Did she ever feel didn't quite belong, or live whole life believing white, never questioning? I'll never know. Jennings's research revealed this common network designed to sever all connections between children and origins. Even when descendants learned truth, usually couldn't trace ancestry back to enslaved relatives. Documentation too thoroughly destroyed, connections too completely severed. System worked exactly as intended, took children legally black, transformed into white people, erased history so completely even modern genealogical tools couldn't fully reconstruct. In 1987, Jennings published book, *Stolen Children, The Hidden History of Racial Passing in the Antebellum South Star. Extensively researched, carefully documented, deeply disturbing. Told story of Levine, Henriette Delacroix, Hartwell, hundreds of children stolen and sold as white. Book reviewed positively in academic journals, some mainstream press attention. New York Times ran feature, Jennings appeared on radio programs discussing findings, but didn't generate public outrage hoped. Part problem timing, published 1987, Reagan era, discussions of race and history often dismissed divisive or unnecessary. Many felt slavery past, time move on, dredging old injustices only created more problems. Part problem story nature, complicated, involving legal technicalities, genealogical research hard general readers follow, raised uncomfortable questions many didn't want confront. If hundreds children stolen and sold white, how many descendants living today? How many white Americans might have enslaved ancestors without knowing? What meant for racial identity, family histories, entire concept of race? Questions challenging fundamental assumptions about identity and belonging many didn't want to engage. But book reached some. Descendants of stolen children contacted Jennings, sharing family stories, asking help tracing ancestry. Some always suspected something wrong, gaps in records, inconsistencies in stories, physical features didn't quite match supposed ancestry. One was Sarah Mitchell, contacted Jennings 2015, nearly 30 years after book published. Sarah grew up Atlanta in white family, no reason question ancestry. But DNA test out curiosity showed small but unmistakable percentage African ancestry, about 12%, suggesting one great-great-grandparent African descent. Dismissed at first as error or distant ancestor didn't know, but researching family history found gaps. Her great-great-grandmother appeared New Orleans 1855 as young child with no clear documentation birth or parentage. Family story orphaned, but no death certificate supposed parents, no records existence at all. Sarah spent 2 years tracing records, working with genealogists, historians, eventually found great-great-great-grandmother's name in Levine's ledger. Child born to enslaved woman Josephine on Haddle Plantation, May 1847. Sold to New Orleans family at 3 days old, given name Emily Harper, raised white. I don't know how feel about this, Sarah told Reporter 2017 after story featured documentary about racial identity America. Part feels discovered important truth about who am. But another part feels lost something. Whole understanding family, identity, place world, all different now. Have you tried find Josephine's other descendants? Reporter asked. I have, Sarah said. But records so fragmentary. No, Josephine had other children before one became Emily Harper, but all sold away. Don't know where went, what happened. Connected few people might distant cousins, but can't prove. Documentation doesn't exist. Paused, added, and can't even find Josephine's descendants if had others. That part family just gone, erased, never able recover. Sarah's story featured PBS documentary 2018 exploring slavery legacy, racial categories construction. Sarah's story won several case studies, reached wider audience than Jennings's book. After documentary aired, dozens contacted producers saying found similar gaps family histories, unexplained DNA results, similar stories children appeared no clear origins. Some researched ancestry years trying understand inconsistencies. Others only recently began questioning identities after DNA tests. Documentary estimated could be hundreds of thousands Americans descended children stolen and sold white, most no idea true ancestry. Network so effective, so thorough erasing records and identities, full scope may never known. Dr. Patricia Jennings died 2003, still working follow-up book expanding research other southern states. Identified over 200 cases children sold white, suspected thousands more left no paper trail. Her research papers donated Tulane University, available scholars studying slavery history, racial identity America. Collection includes copies Levine's ledger, Henriette Delacroix documentation, Hartwell notes, hundreds pages Jennings research, interviews, genealogical charts, parish records analysis, correspondence descendant stolen children. In St. Charles Parish, small museum now dedicated slavery history Louisiana. House restored plantation building, tells story people enslaved, work did, lives lived. One corner exhibit about Dr. Augustus Levine and children tried save. Includes copies ledger pages, plantation photographs, list names, mothers lost children, children stolen, families bought them. Exhibit ends question printed wall large letters, asterisk how many more stories like this hidden our history? How many more children erased? How many more families destroyed system treating human beings property, asterisk no answer provided, just question hanging air, waiting visitors grapple. Museum includes memorial wall names mothers lost children. Names compiled Levine's ledger, Henriette Delacroix documentation, parish records. Over 300 names, Celeste, Josephine, Marie, Margot, Ruth, hundreds others lost history. Visitors often stand wall long time, reading names, trying imagine lives behind. Some cry. Some photograph. Some stand silence, bearing witness crime never prosecuted, grief never acknowledged. Story pale children New Orleans reminder history not just past, about present, ways old crimes continue shape world ways can't always see. About identities stolen, families destroyed, truth buried so deep even now still digging up. Networks stole children, product slavery. But effects rippled forward generations, creating hidden web ancestry even modern DNA testing can't fully untangle. Children sold white had children had children had children. Somewhere America today, people no idea great-great-grandparents born enslaved Louisiana plantation cabins. They grew up believing white, married white, had white children, lived entire lives never knowing truth where from. Most cases, never know. Documentation destroyed, connection severed, truth buried too deep recover. But truth exists even when can't see. Mothers existed, children existed, grief existed, crime existed though no one ever punished. This mystery shows cruelest aspect slavery not always most visible. Sometimes cruelty erasure, systematic destruction identity and family, creation lie so complete became indistinguishable truth. Children stolen didn't just lose freedom, lost histories, identities, connections people loved them. Transformed into something weren't. Never even knew happened. And mothers lived that knowledge rest lives. New children alive somewhere, living white, never knowing where from. New never see again, never hold, never tell truth. Carried grief silently because speaking only bring punishment. System created horror designed invisible, operate shadows, leave no trace. And almost succeeded. If not Levine's compulsive documentation, Henriette Delacroix determination, Hartwell investigation, Jennings research, story might lost completely. But truth survived. Not intact, not complete, but enough tell what happened. Enough honor mothers lost children. Enough acknowledge children stolen. Enough remind history full crimes never punished, injustices never corrected, truths buried but never completely destroyed.